Is there a war on masculinity? There's been a lot of talk recently about toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity for sure, I believe it's a big issue.
And how certain men exhibit attributes.
Make themselves more like, oh, I'm a man, like.
And more biblical frames of masculinity. Where is this thing going? Are we going to see more healthy conversations about toxic femininity? Well, that's what leads us to today's topic. Let's jump into this clip. This was a super dope video by a creator named Jin, and I want to make sure I give him his flowers.
Why has masculinity become demonized?
Merely by raising the issues of boys and men, you put yourself in a particular tribe, and that's the tribe of people on the alt-right, in the manosphere, and therefore against the other tribe, which is the tribe who are worried about women and girls. And if
So he said, just raising men's issues, you're instantly dismissed and put in the tribe of the Andrew Tates, of the Fresh and Fits, of the alt-right.
there are all kinds of challenges facing young men and young women that are different as well as overlapping, and that most people are perfectly capable of holding two thoughts.
Because today the message that is traditionally spoken to men has shifted, and especially in the media. In the controversial Gillette We Believe ad in 2019.
You seen this ad, Ray Rock?
Nah.
The Gillette We Believe, you ever seen this?
Nah.
Oh, this is great. This was like the Bud Light situation before the Bud Light. This is actually worse than a Bud Light situation.
Is this the best a man can get? It's been going on far too long.
The ads also address issues like bullying and harassment in a way that seem to portray masculinity as a whole as violent, sexist, and toxic. In a recent study of over 4,000 men in Europe, they found that thinking masculinity is bad for your behavior is linked to having worse mental health.
And this is not a small sample size, okay? This is 4,000 men, okay? So usually when you're doing surveys and you're looking at data, a reasonable sample size is about 1,000 people, right? Like anything above 1,000, like, okay, that's a good study that's conducted. Like this is reasonable research. 4,000 men, and they found that thinking masculinity is bad for your behavior is linked to having worse mental well-being.
But when men are viewed as oppressors, is there even any room for empathy for male struggles? What do you think are some of the challenges that men are facing today?
Masculinity, definitely. I don't know, people will be like, oh shoot, like you have long hair, you look like a girl, this and that. Other men trying to like make themselves more like, oh, I'm a man, like.
Roles, stereotypes, toxic masculinity for sure, I believe it's a big issue. It's okay if you don't want to feel vulnerable or whatever, but they should just ask for help.
There are a lot of men who are really struggling right now. There's a reason why men are at 3 times higher risk of a death of despair from suicide or drug overdose or alcohol.
In your definition, it seems like a man who is acting very, let's say, masculine might be considered toxic masculinity. Would the opposite be considered toxic femininity?
Uh-oh. So one, there's obviously goofy tropes, like if you have long hair, you're a girl.
Right.
Like, there's a gang of dudes that got long hair that are extremely masculine.
What I make of it is that there's an overcorrection happening with something bad to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there is something as toxic masculinity, but now anything that looks masculine goes to the garbage now, right? You can't even grill some steaks. What are you like? What that commercial's so silly to me.
That toxic masculinity. He's on a grill eating meat. Toxic masculinity.
This whole oppressive idea oppresses everybody. Okay.
Because if you're looking at the world through the worldview or the ideology that everything is broken into oppressor and oppressed categories, and that is the paradigm you see everything through, well then, of course, it's easier just to blame patriarchy and the system and capitalism and all these different things. It's just an easy out to not have to deal with the deeper issue.
There's a lot of things that we've allowed as Christian men in the past, and now we're reaping what we're sowing.
Okay, unpack that.
There are some things that weren't godly that fell under masculinity,
Okay.
right? That now is giving birth to what we have, right? It's giving birth to a group of people, especially women, that are like, we don't want that. We want to be able to be open and share our dreams with you without you telling us to shut up and be barefoot and pregnant. You know what I'm saying? On the flip side, right, what also comes out of that is a group of people who feel so triggered that any form of masculinity is being taken away from them, that they want all of the old school masculinity and even anything that was bad that came with it as well.
Sure.
So that's how you have the birth of the red pill. They're like, man, they want to double down, on something that's not masculinity either.
There's definitely some things that obviously women, you were talking about, was it your grandma that like couldn't buy a car, or your aunt?
You couldn't buy a car
in the 70s.
In the 70s without having a male sign for that car for you.
That's crazy. Yeah, I think the tricky part is, to your point, is have we now overcorrected to the point where any concept of headship, protection, anything like that is now discarded and deemed as toxic? And the flip side of this is, and then are women never held accountable? Which brings us to the next clip of this conversation, toxic femininity.
The way I said it, I guess it should be. I don't think that that's ever been talked about, really.
What do you think is more
It's never been talked about. That's what he says. It's never been talked about.
common, toxic masculinity or toxic femininity?
I think we've mostly focused on men and like patriarchy.
I've never heard about toxic femininity.
I think in general in society, we're more accustomed to hearing about toxic masculinity rather than toxic femininity.
Everybody's kind of toxic in their own way. We don't go through life the same way that men do. Guys can just walk out at night and be like, I can go on the stroll at midnight. I can't do that. Women and
Okay, so she actually, I think, is the closest. She said we're all toxic in our own way.
Yeah.
You notice the issue here, though?
She's self-aware.
You notice the issue here is that there's this need to overcompensate, to generalize in groups instead of focusing on the individual. If we focus on the individual and we just stop with the cap for a minute, bro, everyone is toxic to various degrees. Everyone has different attributes that are dysfunctional, that are self-destructive, that are harmful to themselves. But in order to acknowledge the individual, now we're actually getting to the surface, which is sin.
Absolutely.
The issue is the sin in all of us that causes us to act out in ways that are harmful.
Let me ask you a question. Okay. Sometimes when a sin lives for a long time, the reaction, because it's compounded, is sometimes
it's visceral. It's visceral in the other direction. I get it. Here's something else she said here. She said men can just go outside at midnight and go to the store if they feel like it. I disagree with that. If I'm in Times Square and it's midnight, everything is open. I can run down to the Walgreens right there.
Right.
My wife can run down to the Walgreens right there. Right? Now I'm going to go to the Walgreens. Right. Just because why would I, inconvenience her?
Right.
If I'm in O Block, I'm not going outside, Ray. Right?
Well, we're talking about context.
If I'm in Nickerson Gardens, I'm not going outside. I think we forget how real the world gets. Like, I think we forget how dark things get. I think we forget how left things can go. So this notion of like, this is bad, that bad. Listen, we should all be operating with a certain degree of wisdom in terms of how we move around. We should all be situationally aware. I'm teaching this to my 8-year-old. When you go into a restaurant or into a facility, don't sit with your back towards the exit. Or the entrance. Like, watch who's coming in. Keep an eye on these things. Like, there's a degree to be hyper vigilant in these things. But I think this notion that like, oh well, a woman can't feel safe, but a man can feel safe. Like, I don't know, man. I've been in some sketchy places,
and I think you would do that.
I got out of there.
I think you would do that whether your 8-year-old was a male or a female. I think you would want to train your children to know their surroundings and to know what's strange behavior.
The issue is, if we're overcorrecting, why are we not addressing the dysfunction on both sides? That's the issue. And why are we not addressing the lack of wisdom on both sides? I remember this one time. Me and Belief were on the west side of Chicago. We were leaving a show. We performed this thing, and we pulled over to get gas. And I had on some fresh J's. This is early. It's like 2008. I had on some fresh J's and a big old coat. And I very quickly knew where we were at. Very quickly. And we saw dudes, they're looking, they're pointing, blah, 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 blah. And so, like, I'm trying to get out of there. There's zero ego. There's zero, I'm gonna put my chest out. Like, there's zero toxic masculinity. I'm trying to leave.
Most toxic femininity, I would say, is among girls. I'd say that girls are more judgmental toward girls than guys. And like, let's say, even if a girl has more traditional opinions, I don't know, if a girl want to be a housewife, they're gonna like judge.
So her assessment, and I don't know if this is true, but that girls are harsher towards girls. And that girls will judge other girls, especially if a girl wants to be a housewife, harsher.
But I also think that that's a product of toxic masculinity.
How is that a product of toxic masculinity? It's toxic of toxic femininity.
Children will replicate what is normative when they grow up.
Okay.
Okay. If your mom is being treated like a second-class citizen,
I'm
telling you,
Ray.
I'm telling you,
no.
Listen.
So you're saying because men treat women poorly, that women grow up and see other women who aspire to be stay-at-home mom and wives
in the past,
and then treat other women poorly?
In the past,
I think you're giving men way too much credit, bro.
Before women got a chance to vote, okay, everything we've honored everyone first before women. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
That's the situation. Even in our law, in the system of law, you get what I'm saying?
Yes.
So I'm just saying, there's something called the male gaze. Okay, the male gaze is when media is designed for the consumer, and when at a time the person that was the consumer first was men. So commercials, ads,
of course,
things throughout history were created for men. That intrinsically informs the way children grow up in a home and the way they see themselves. Okay,
and that is possible.
No,
I'm not saying it. I'm not disagreeing.
I'm talking
with you.
about okay.
There
How
are
about
women
this?
in
How
the
about
chat.
this?
There are women
How
in the
about
chat
this?
that are just saying it's as simple as women not wanting to hold other women accountable.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. But what is that? What is that? Is that a response? Some of this is part of our fault, and we need to take responsibility.
But men have taken responsibility.
We haven't taken responsibility.
Come on, man.
Enough, okay?
Come on, brother. What does that even look like? What are we talking about?
Listen, bro. Agree to disagree, and that's totally fine.
So, but no. But this is the,
let
this
me
is
ask
the
you a question.
What do you mean by take responsibility? How do I, as a man, take responsibility for women not having the right to vote 100 years ago and your aunt not being able to buy a car in the 70s without her husband
I want to
present?
take responsibility for the parts of toxic masculinity that are ungodly.
Be specific.
So here's specifically, okay? When my daughter is playing with other children, right? When I was growing up and a girl was doing something that was physical, similar versus when boys were doing something physical, they're just horsing around, they're boys.
Okay.
When a girl did it, that's not ladylike. Okay.
Okay, I've never said that to my 2-year-old once. I've never said that to my niece once.
That's because you're doing something that the men before us didn't do. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that as my friend, you don't reduce their actions of them just being children.
That's right.
To them being female.
Okay.
You get what I'm saying?
Yep.
Children play. Children,
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
That's right.
So what I'm saying is when you take responsibility for it, you don't do those things.
But taking responsibility just sounds like not being a jerk to little babies.
No, it's not reducing.
Don't be an awful human to kids that are developing. That's what you're saying, right? Ultimately,
there's a lot of things that are reduced in our culture. Like, for example, me growing up, I'm Puerto Rican in the Caribbean, right? Like a very common thing to do is to take a 12-year-old to a brothel. Okay.
Oh, that's disgusting.
Right. That's disgusting. Right. But just like we would do that to boys, okay, we would do other things to females. We would keep them from certain things. Okay. Because we deem certain things to be unladylike. Right. All right. And so what I'm basically saying is that we need to take responsibility where it's ungodly. Right. And to each his own. Because we can't erase all the things in the past. And I'm not trying not to hold women accountable when they need to be held accountable. Okay. I'm just saying that as the leaders of homes, we're responsible for some of this stuff that we're seeing today.
Yes. And I would say women being sheltered was a thing, but we need to call out ungodly behavior on both sides. Hey, this is a segment from our daily after party stream. Consider partnering with us online for as little as $5 a month to get access to these daily after party streams completely unedited. You'll also get access to our podcast as they are streamed live into the community before anyone else gets to see them, get to interact with our guests, get access to our private Discord server, and a discount code for our store for as little as $5 a month. Ultimately, that will help towards helping us continue contextualizing the gospel using media and podcast here on YouTube. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.